friends. It's Parshat Noach, and I want to connect our learning today to our conversation yesterday. Yesterday, we looked at the lead in to Parshat Noach from the chapter of last week's Torah portion. We go straight from Genesis, the creation, to Noach, the uncreating through a flood of the world. And the reason for it, the moral justification in the Torah for the flood, is that the world became full of bad. And there isn't actually a description of what kind of bad, but we have to imagine that the badness, that the evil, that the destruction raised was so big that it got God's attention so much that God's intention in creating the world was undone. Another way of saying that is we could undo the world when we act in destructive ways. Yesterday, I focused pretty intensely on anti-Semitism and read the words of Eric Goldstein, the CEO of UJA, my teacher, my friend, who called out Kanye West for his terrible anti-Semitic comments and the former President Trump for his incitement and endorsement of so much hatred, including warning the Jews to get their act together before it's too late. That kind of language has become mainstream in America, and we know that anti-Semitism has always been present, as our teacher Eric Ward, a civil rights activist and thought leader and friend, has said that the two heads of the hatred hydra are anti-black racism and anti-Semitism. Where we see those uglinesses, we can see that the world is in terrible shape. And so it is important for us to know and remember that the evil that causes the destruction of the world is not only a biblical story of a flood, it is hatred of epic proportions on the airwaves today. Well, over yesterday and today, because of the campaigns of many organizations, many entertainment leaders, many politicians, not only was Kanye West roundly condemned, but he lost the endorsement of major supporters, including a completely made documentary of him by a group called MRC. They shelved the documentary because of the hatred, and just today, Adidas dropped Kanye West. Now, that is a success for those fighting hatred, but there are a few things that remain necessary to say, and I'll bring it right back to the Parsha in a second. Number one, Kanye West is not the only voice of anti-Semitism, and he is clearly suffering. And I'm not saying this with any clinical knowledge. It seems to me, I should say, that he is suffering from severe mental illness. The way that he speaks, the disjointed way that he expresses his art, which maybe should be separated from the person. It's a very big conversation. It's very complicated to see this moment, but it is important to say that the end of his endorsement with Adidas and the round condemnation that he has received is not enough. Is not enough. Because it is not actually about him. And it is too easy to look at one voice spouting ugliness and say that that's the problem. So I want to phrase a question, look at the Parsha, and then extend our thinking. The question is, how good do we have to be? First of all, if you want to see models of goodness, look at our dear friend Blair's new book called Chosen, A Life Ordained and Purposed by God. She is an incredible soul and now a published author. So please visit and buy her book, and then tell her on this broadcast how cool she is, because I think she's pretty amazing. How good do we have to be is the question that I was asking. Look at this week's Parsha, because it begins with a very famous verse. I'll read it in the Hebrew and then do some translating. Ela toldot Noach, Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav, et ha-Elohim hitalech Noach. This is the translation in the JPS, Jewish Publication Society. This is the line of Noach. Noach was a righteous man. He was blameless in his age. Noach walked with God. Now here is some of the Hebrew in its original, and I want to tell you why the JPS translation, and perhaps any translation, will be inadequate. Eile toldot Noach. These are the generations of Noach. Okay. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav. Listen to these words in sequence. I'll just translate them without trying to make an English sentence. Noach, person, good, simple, was in his generation. And it's been understood by many to say that Noach was good for his generation. In his generation, he was good. Now, we know that there is good, and then there is better. There's also relative good. And so Noach ish tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav, he was righteous for his generation. Well, what do we know about his generation? Whatever they did was bad enough that God wanted to undo creation. It was bad enough that it warranted a flood. So, if everyone in the world is doing terrible things, and what makes you different is that you're not as terrible, or maybe you don't do bad, that doesn't mean that you do good. Tzaddik Tamim Haya B'Dorotav, he was a simply righteous person for his generation. So Rashi and ancient commentaries ask, what if he had lived during the time of Moses? Would he have been judged as good? In a world where anti-Semitism, anti-black racism, anti-Asian violence, homophobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, misogyny, these things are very, very present in public discourse. Now, anti-Semitism is our tribal experience of hatred, and it is a unique form of hatred, perhaps the most ancient of them all. But it is clear that what so many of us are sharing right now, Linda has shared and Joy has shared, and I know many, many stories that have been shared by people who experienced anti-Semitism very frequently in schools and in neighborhoods in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I wasn't subject to it in my childhood, but I've seen plenty of it, having lived in places of deep intolerance during my life. How good is good enough, friends? We succeeded in this campaign to have Adidas drop Kanye. But did we actually call out the politicians who've spoken in anti-Semitic tropes? Have we called out those who use critique of Israel, legitimate critique of Israel, and then twist it into an anti-Jewish sentiment? Because the bridge from anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism is pretty short, pretty narrow, and very easy to cross. Have we called out those who point at Jews? I've been teaching a lot about early Zionism recently, and the language of Herzl, and the language of Achad Ha'am, and the language of other early Zionist leaders and poets and spokespeople was that we have tried to fit in. We have done our best to assimilate into the world, but that doesn't work. We are never accepted. And I don't know how true that is. It is very true, but I'm not sure that it needs to be true, meaning we have created partnerships and coalitions with neighbors who are similarly vulnerable in the world. And that might be even a better protection of the Jewish community than building thicker walls. It is very, very important for us to call out anti-Semitism everywhere it is spoken, everywhere it is accepted. It is very clear that America is in the midst of a very terrible struggle against fundamentalisms of many kinds. But the fundamentalism that is raising its head, its very, very ugly head, and seems to be more accepted, is white nationalism, which has a flag. It looks like the Confederate flag. It might be the swastika in a newer form. And that Confederate flag has been connected with anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, the attack on democracy on January 6th of 2021. We have enormous work ahead of us, friends, and anti-Semitism reminds us of that work. So the question I want to ask you one more time is, how good do we have to be? Let me use the verse from this week's Parsha and then maybe challenge us to do some specific thinking. The verse again is Noach ish tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav. Noach was a righteous person for his generation. Well, if we respond only to Kanye and not to the former president, and not to those who seem to be embracing white nationalism or replacement theory, which is another iteration of the forged protocols of the elders of Zion, where people accuse Jews, quote, globalists, of replacing white people in power and replacing them with black people, people of color. That is the protocols of the Elder of Zion's conspiracy theory against the Jews. That is anti-Semitism and anti-black racism mixed into one, and that is the tenor of American politics today. We must, of course, Natalie, as you said, think of Jews as a group. That's true. That's true. But if we only protect the group that we call family, and we don't call our neighbor family, I know a poem by Pastor Niemöller that makes us all scared. First, they came for the trade unionists, but I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak. Then they came for the Protestants. And one by one, they came for that group and that group and that group. And when they finally came for me, there was no one left to speak up for me. We have learned, especially as Jews, over the course of our history, the price not just of silence, but the cost of ignoring the welfare of our neighbor. If we expect a better day as Jews in America, we must begin by protecting self and other. I need to think of self and other at the same time. That's what it means to be created in the image of God. We must continue to speak out, because how good must we be? We must be good. Yes, Natalie, I hear you. We must be good. We must be better. Not better than. We must be better with. Noach ish tzaddik tamim haya b'dorotav. How good was he? He built the ark and saved the animals and his family. But the Torah never tells us that he warned his neighbors. The Midrash starts to. The Midrash begins to say that Noach must have reached out to others. But the Torah doesn't say that. Why does the Midrash say it? The Midrash says that because any good person would have. Any good person must. So in a moment of toxic American societal life, we are called to do better, not just to rally in protection of the self, but to see every vulnerable other as our neighbor who we are called to love by the Torah. So I want to bless you not with tying this up in a bow, but also not feeling satisfied by the organizing that we've done yesterday and today. Friends, let's step up. We must, we must, we must. So bless you. Thank you for being part of the community that learns Torah and loves our neighbors well. We'll see each other tomorrow again. Let's sing our way into a good day. Ya la 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 la, diddy ya la la la, diddy ya la 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 la, ay ay la la la, ay la 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 la, diddy ya la la la, diddy ya la 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 la, ay ay la la la. See you tomorrow, friends. Take care.